Hello again, and today we're going to talk about, again, still Lakota Stories from James and Marshall III. Sorry, Joseph. James, again, it's the actor. Just an interview with him, too. So, this is about sacrifice, to give of oneself an offering. Are you going to come here or not? Okay. This is the story of the Thunders. They're babies. They're babies. Got all the babies here for this one. In the old days, some men took more than one wife. We wonder today what that might be like to have more than one wife. Sometimes we laugh about it, and some of us, deep down, could be a little envious. Back then, however, when a man had more than one wife, it meant that he had to work harder. He had to provide more food, more meat, and more animal hides for clothing. So he had to hunt more. And if more children came, well, then he had to work that much harder. The excitement of having more than one wife was not all there was to it. Most of the time it was for practical reasons, like when a man would take a friend who was killed in battle. Or he would marry the younger sister of his wife because the first wife wanted it that way. Sometimes things went smoothly, sometimes things did not. Such was the case with a certain woman in the time before the horses came. The people had moved into the open country, across what we call the plains. There were many scattered encampments from the great muddy river west as far as the Black Hills, south to the Running Water River, and north to the Knife River. Some were as close as 1 or 2 days of travel, and others were many, many days apart. In one village just east of the Black Hills there was a woman named Luta, or Red Shawl. She had married a man who was a good provider and had a good reputation. No children were born to them for many years. Then she bore him a son. So she was surprised when her husband announced that he would take a second, younger wife. An old man and woman in another village had raised their granddaughter for both her parents when both her parents had frozen to death in a blizzard. They were getting on in years and wanted to see their granddaughter Necklace married to a good man, so they approached White Wing, Red Shawl's husband, and he had agreed. Red Shawl never once thought that she would have to share her husband with another woman, although at first wife, the sits beside him wife, she would be able to say how her lodge should be cared for. She was still jealous. When White Wing left to bring home the new wife, Red Shawl packed a few belongings and the bow and arrows he made for her and stole away in the night. She tossed scraps of meat to the camp dogs so they wouldn't bark and alert the night sentinels posted around the encampment. She told no one of her plan, so when her lodge door stayed shut for several days the people suspected she had left, but didn't know where she might have gone. She had seen such things before, a first wife moving out because of jealousy. Red Shawl traveled east, intending to stay with a cousin who was part of a band living just west of the great muddy river. The village meant many, many days of travel, but like all Lakota women of her day, Red Shawl was strong and resourceful. She knew how to hunt, how to be watchful of enemies, and how to pitch a safe, hidden night camp. She could not travel fast because she was carrying her weapons, a large rawhide case filled with food, and her infant son in his cradle board. He wasn't heavy, but he did need to suckle her breast, so she would have to stop often to feed him. After a few days' travel, she decided to make camp for a day, mainly to rest her tired feet. Between the sheltering branches of 2 buffalo-berry thickets, high on a slope, she made a cozy camp and spent the day playing with her son. She was still confused over her husband's marriage to a second wife, and her heart was broken, but she tried not to think about that. In the afternoon a warm breeze sang them both to sleep. Toward sundown a deep rumble of thunder woke her, and Red Shaw saw that dark gray storm clouds had taken away the blue sky, Lightning flashed within the thick, folded clouds and turned the breezes into angry, gusting winds that suddenly bent the buffalo berry thickets and shook them about. Red Shawl gathered her things and decided to look for better shelter from the rain she knew would come. She remembered a low thicket of chokecherry not far away and hurried toward it. A summer thunderstorm is the most powerful of the beings that live above the prairie country, second only to the great twisting winds that can uproot great trees and fill the skies with their terrible blackness. Red Shawl had never seen such a wind, but was fearful that she might. She had to bend into the gusts to keep from falling and turn away from the wind as leaves stung her face. She covered her baby's cradle board as small branches flew like arrows and dust stung her eyes. An angry gust tore her food pack away from her and tossed it a long stone's throw, nearly pulling the cradle board away too. She crawled the last few paces to a low thicket, covering her baby with her body to protect him from the wind that was now a steady roar in her ears. Her food gone, her weapons lost, she pushed into the thicket and curled up into a ball with her back to the wind. Then came wind-driven, heavy, cold drops that felt like pebbles when they hit bare skin, and with them came a sudden darkness. Red Shawl could do nothing but huddle over her baby to shield him from the storm. The rain turned into a cloud burst, drenching the land. She was soaked to her skin, and her deer-hide dress was cold and heavy. Little by little the wind slowed, but the rain kept pounding the land. Tiny streams of water coursed around them, and Red Shawl had to lift the cradle board off the grass to keep her baby as dry as possible. Wiping the water out of her eyes, she tried to look round for a high spot, a hill or a knoll, knowing the safest place for them was high ground. Red Shawl had never been alone in bad weather. In the past, when the winter blizzards soared over the land, she was safe in her mother and father's lodge. When the spring and summer wind when the spring and summer winds storm suddenly fell upon them, everyone in the encampment pounded down their picket pins tight and closed their lodge doors. If there was danger, it didn't seem as bad because many people were around. Now, as the cold rain pelted her face, Red Shawl suddenly understood what it meant to be truly alone. She was alone in a dark land that existed only as far as she could see. She hung on tight to the cradle board and headed for the south side of the long gully, hoping to climb its ridge and find some shelter, any shelter. Slipping and sliding in the mud slowed her down, so she stopped to rest in the lee side of a sturdy cottonwood tree. The rain kept coming down heavier and heavier until every low area was running with water. A soft whimper reminded her that her breasts were full and it was time to feed the baby. Turning away from the rain as much as she could, she opened the covering of the cradle board and fed the hungry baby. For a few moments, she forgot about the rain as she enjoyed the closeness she felt with her baby. He was so hungry he quickly drained her breast and switched him to the other. Resting against the tree, Red Shawl shivered in her wet clothes, thankful that she had managed to keep the baby as dry as possible. The sudden storm had shaken her up, reminding her that life was a journey full of the unexpected, like a second wife for her husband. She knew his reason for taking that second wife was not to replace her, but to provide a place for someone who would need a provider and a protector. Red Shawl looked at her son, at his trusting eyes. Her fit of girlish jealousy had placed him in danger. She felt small and foolish. When the storm passed, she would head home, she decided. The wind had taken away her food and weapons, and it would be beyond foolish to continue her journey. Perhaps she thought the wind was trying to teach her a lesson. Red Shawl drew her son close, and then heard a low, rumbling noise. A strange kind of thunder seemed to roll down from the sky. Then she realized it was not thunder from the clouds or the wind. It was a flash flood rolling down a deep gully. the gully she was in. Red Shawl had never in her life seen anything like the mass of dark rolling water rushing toward her. Broken tree branches rolled with the churning water, reaching up and out like hands wanting to pull her in. It was no use to run. She knew the rolling water would sweep them away. She forced herself to look away from the approaching death and somehow looked up to the fork of the sturdy cottonwood. There was no time to climb. She stood and reached up as high as she could and jammed the cradle board into the fork of the tree. Tying the steps around the fork, she prayed even as she wept, "Grandfather, take me if you must, but spare my son." The cold water grabbed her legs and pulled her into its churning black current. Red Shawl woke in cold and blackness, yet her body seemed hot with pain as she coughed and coughed. After painfully pulling herself into a sitting position, she realized she was caught in sandbar willows. She was somewhere near a river or creek, she thought, because sandbar willows only grew along stream banks. Then she heard the gurgling voice of flowing water. Remembering the flood, she tried to jump to her feet. A hot, stabbing pain in her ankle stopped her, and she had to lean back until the pain passed. In the blackness of the night sky above, she saw stars. The storm had passed. Shivering, she tried to remember everything, but only picture in her mind was a churning wall of dark, murky water. Except for the cold night air, the pain in her ankle, and the fullness of her breasts, she was without feeling or memories. Then her heart seemed to stop. Her breasts were full, ready to be suckled. Her baby, where was her baby? Memories of the day past swept her away, throwing her down into a dark hole of despair. She had lived through the flash flood, but she had lost her baby. Red Shawl up in the cold, wet mud and wept. The pain in her ankle was nothing compared to the searing grief in her heart. She tore at her hair and clothes as her pain cried out from the pit of her being. Then she pounded the mud until her fists were numb. Slowly, then, a clear memory of the flood began to push itself into her mind, like the sun chasing away a storm cloud. Red Shawl remembered the sturdy cottonwood tree. She remembered putting the cradle board in the fork and tying it fast. She wept again, but this time in hope. Perhaps the flood hadn't taken her baby. Perhaps the cottonwood had been strong enough to stand in the churning current. Ignoring the pain in her ankle, she rose and staggered around in the darkness. There was only one thing to do: find that tree. Though the sky was filled with stars, there was no moon. As her mind began to clear, she could hear coyotes barking all around her, then wolves howling far away. There are other things in the darkness that were far more dangerous than coyotes and wolves. Bears were known to maim and kill two-leggeds, likewise the great cat. All the more reason to find her baby. Red Shawl heard the birds beginning to awaken, then noticed a pale glow over the horizon. Dawn was approaching. That meant she had been knocked out for most of the night, and she wondered how far the flood had carried her. Slowly and slowly the light grew and shadows took the shapes of the hills and trees. Waiting was difficult, but she knew it would be wiser to be patient until there was more light. She was glad to know which way was east. Light gave her a chance to look at her injured ankle. It was badly sprained, though she couldn't remember how. Somewhere in the hazy distance she heard the bellow of a bull buffalo and the trilling call of a red-winged blackbird's morning song. Life started new each day, and Red Shawl prayed that her baby was somewhere alive. Hawks took to the sky and soared on the cool morning breezes. A river was close because the valley was full of trees, and the mist from the waters hung above them. But she couldn't recognize the land. She was far from home, though like all Lakota she was a good traveler, always looking at her back trail. Something she had been taught as a girl. She would have recognized country she had passed through. Immediately she looked around for the slope with the sturdy cottonwood, hoping that she had not been swept far from that. But she could see nothing familiar. As the first rays of the new sun hit her face, she stood and turned west. There were some realities in her favor. The storm had come from the west, and the cottonwood tree in which she had put her baby had been on the east-facing slope. A flood had come from the west, and had swept her down slope to the east, toward the river. Behind her the river was flowing north. She could have been swept into it somewhere to the south, to her left, and carried along by its flood-swollen current to where she had awakened. Rethinking all of this, she turned her limping steps to the south. Red Shawl ignored the hunger in her stomach. A gentle morning breeze chilled her but helped to dry out her dress. She was barefoot and bare-legged, her moccasins and leggings taken by the flood. Grabbing a broken branch, she used it as a walking stick. She kept a steady pace, knowing she couldn't walk fast with her injured ankle, and at mid-morning she stopped at a cool spring and drank its clear water. The day was warming, and it gave her renewed hope. Close to midday she paused to rest her ankle, and realized she reached the gully that had been flooded. Great piles of broken branches and flattened grass silently told the story of yesterday's flash flood. She gasped as she recognized a sturdy cottonwood. Ignoring her throbbing ankle, she tried to run, but even as she drew near to the tree, she saw that its branches held no cradleboard. Perhaps, she tried to reason, this isn't the tree? But the torn-up gully could not be mistaken. She reached the tree and knew she had been here. She knew that she had placed her son in a right fork and tied his cradleboard to it. There was nothing here. Redshaw fell to the ground and wept. If only she had stayed home. If only she had not gotten angry over her husband's second wife. Wiping away her tears, she stood and followed the path of the flood, looking for the cradleboard with her son in it. The path of destruction was easy to follow. She had been swept along here, and she wondered how it was she was still alive. At the river's edge she turned and followed it north. When the sun was low in the western sky, she had returned to the spot she had awakened. She had not eaten and taken water only once, but she didn't care. She wanted to die. Like the day before, clouds rimmed over the western horizon, but this day they were white and billowy, not low and dark. Resting against a small oak, Redshaw wept quietly. "You who live in the clouds," she prayed, "take pity on my son. He is so small and helpless. Take his spirit up to grandfather, if you would be so kind. I want to be with my son." Redshaw cried herself to sleep. She woke just after sundown to a strange feeling in her full breasts, reminding her of her mind-numbing loss. Night was coming, and she wept again, great sobs shaking her body. Mercifully, her weariness of her body, weak from hunger, dragged her into sleep. A frightening dream of dark, swirling water woke her sometime in the night. To the west was a distant rumble of thunder and flashes of lightning. She immediately recalled her situation and fell into despair, knowing that she had failed as a mother and as a wife. "You who live in the clouds," she prayed once again as thunder rolled beyond the horizon, "be kind to my son. Take him where it is safe." She thought that she would never be remembered as a good woman, but as a foolish and jealous one who had caused the death of her own son. In her mind she could see him, his dark eyes looking up at her with trust. It was all that she would ever have of him. The honorable thing to do was go back to the village, she thought, and tell White Wing that her foolishness had killed their son. Even if he were to forgive her, she could never forgive herself. Though he was a good man, Redshaw knew it was not likely that White Wing would welcome her back. It would be more likely that she would be banished from the village and forced to wander alone for the rest of her life. Once more the soft, round little face of her son appeared in her mind. She could hear his soft voice, too. Perhaps that's what grief did to someone, she thought as she wept quietly. When she finally calmed herself, she heard that soft voice again. In her despair, she reached out. and touched something in the darkness. Lightning flashed, and in that instant of light she saw the cradle board and heard her son cry out in hunger. Disbelief tormented her. She expected the image of her son to fade away in the next heartbeat, but it didn't. Instead, he cried out again. With a shout of joy, she grabbed the cradle board and breathed on his tiny face. He was there. Redshaw's joy knew no bounds. "Thank you, grandfather," she cried. "Thank you, who live in the clouds." She unwrapped him from the cradle board and fed him. He eagerly suckled at her breast, feeling what seemed his bottomless hunger. Then she took him into the water, and they bathed together. They slept on the grassy slope, caressed by warm breezes. In the light of a new day they began their journey home. Sometime on the second day White Wing appeared, and Redshaw was overjoyed yet again. From their appearance he could tell that his wife and son had been through a difficult time. He made camp and saw to their comfort. "I have decided to take Necklace back to her grandparents," he said. "There are many good men who could take her for a wife." "No," said Redshaw. "That would bring her shame. I will welcome her into our lodge because I will always be honored to be your first wife." Then she told him about the flood, and that their son had been lost and then returned by the thunderers. Though she never questioned why her son had been returned, for the rest of her life Redshaw wondered how it had happened. It was a joyful mystery and a reality that sometimes was hard to believe, one that she looked upon as a gift. To show gratitude for such a gift, she knew she had to give herself in return. So Redshaw took her rightful place as White Wing's first wife and welcomed Necklace as she would a sister. In time they became close, and were both known far and wide as selfless and devoted mothers. Redshaw's son grew tall and strong and was devoted to his mother. When he was 15, White Wing bestowed on the boy the name his mother had given him. For the rest of his life he was known as Wakinyan Iglipi, brought back by the thunders. Redshaw lived a long life and was regarded by many as a good, wise woman. When someone would praise her for her wisdom, she would thank them and quietly tell the story of how her son came by his name, and how even foolishness can lead to wisdom. Those who knew her would listen in the spring and summer, especially when the thunders rumbled and lightning flashed inside the great rolling clouds. They would listen as she stood outside her lodge singing an honor song for those who lived in the clouds. Thank you.